that stuff's all very well, of course. There's only one really interesting thing about writing, which is cuneiform writing, and with your track here, I'm going to make the most of it. So, this thing about the giant leap for mankind and all that stuff is all very well too. It's like Tom Lehrer said, you know, that the Americans thought they made the first giant leap for mankind by putting some clown on the moon, and that's not a good role model for assessing importance, in my humble opinion. So, this is a contemporary watercolour of Ashurbanipal, just found in the Queen's collection, very remarkable thing, and the shelf of the libraries we reconstructed. So, and again, sorry, keep cool. Right, are there any questions? Okay, this is an infantile map. My personal experience, the only kind of maps which are in any way intelligible are for 5-year-olds. So we're going to be talking about the blue bit, you are, mostly, and sometimes we might cross a border into a neighbouring simple colour. So, I'd just like to say this does not happen in the British Museum. Now, the thing is, do you know, is that the... Hold on, excuse me just a minute while I talk among myself. Yes, okay. Cuneiform tablets, we have 135,000 of them at the moment. Of course, in due course we'll get all the others, I hope. They actually come out of the ground. They are harvested like potatoes by archaeologists who dig rather like farmers. This is an example of a site. And it's called a tell mound, and it's where people live for many thousands of years, leaving their debris. And when you excavate them, if you have any idea what you're supposed to be doing, you usually find thousands and thousands of tablets. Because nowadays, they don't bother with that. They find things like soil samples and dribbly bits of potsherd and all that kind of stuff. They don't know how to do it. What you do is you walk around the mound and you go like this, and then you know where to dig the holes. Now, when I was a student, W.G. Lambert, the great Assyriologist and well-known crook, I was brought up to believe that tablets originated in the British Museum in this very room. I didn't know about the Iraqi side of it, the ground and the trouble work, until I joined the staff, which was in 1979. I'm afraid they never quite recovered. So, this is the situation. The cuneiform writing system is, as far as we know, the oldest. Of course, it can't possibly be that because we don't know anything, but from a textbook point of view, it's the oldest system of writing. So we have 3 millennia of cuneiform tablets written on pieces of clay, and it's a miraculous matter that they decided to use riverine clay as their writing support. They didn't muck around with parchment or wood or paper or any of those trivial things which will never last, not to mention computers. They used clay, and clay lasts forever even if it's not baked. And so good archaeologists who know where to find them have sometimes found 20,000 tablets on an excavation because they survive in the ground in a God-given fashion, and they come out of the ground and they're wet, and you dry them in the air and they become hard like this, and they last forever. They last forever. When in the old days, the good old days when the British Library was under our control in our building, in the latter days of their tenure there, they suddenly felt guilty, and they used to put up posters with a kind of medieval leather book with worms in it and bits falling off and stuff like that, saying in a pathetic way, adopt a book. And I have to say, Christopher Walker and myself, the only two cuneiformists on the staff, then used to throw past this in a highly derisive way, because we knew in our heart of hearts that everything in this building will no longer exist. Every single thing in this building will no longer exist, and our tablets still will. So this guy here is a Sumerian priest. He's got large ears, he's got wide open eyes, listening to the words of the Lord, or the words of the many lords in his case, sitting in a complacent way with his hands folded over his belly. He spoke Sumerian. So as far as we know, Sumerian is the oldest language known to archaeology. Now this is something worth thinking about, because of the situation We know a lot about Sumerian now. In fact, we can translate loads of it. It's remarkable considering no one can read a word of it for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. But we have control over Sumerian, we can understand it now. And we know enough about it to say that the Sumerian tongue, which comes off these tablets, has no relative, no modern relative or no ancient relative among any of the other languages of the world. And when you look at languages in a global way, they all fall into families, and sometimes you have to squeeze a bit here and a bit there, but you have Semitic languages and Indo-European languages and Hamitic languages, and all the tongues that come to light that have been discovered can more or less be moulded into one of these spreading branch kind of derivations. But this one can't. The only people who say it can are one scholar from Finland who thinks it's related to Finnish, one scholar from New Zealand who thinks it's related to New Zealish. The fact of the matter is, it has nothing to do with any modern language. So this is a spectacular conception to think of, because you have a stratum of chronology in which writing comes into being. And when it arrives, it is just in time to scoop up that Sumerian language, which in its own time undoubtedly had many relatives that go back thousands and thousands of years into prehistory. So it's a kind of miraculous thing that the writing started just in time to rescue Sumerian. And Sumerian existed in Mesopotamia side by side with Akkadian, or Babylonian, or Assyrian, dialects of the same language, Akkadian, which from about 2800 existed side by side with Sumerian for the next 3,000 years. So the scribes, the boys at school who learned to read and write the cuneiform system, whether they spoke Sumerian first or Babylonian first, they had to learn both, and that's what they did. And it's very fortunate for us because the fact that they had a bilingual education enabled us to understand Sumerian, which otherwise will be totally, totally impossible. So we can read Babylonian as fluently as Hebrew and Arabic. In fact, we know more about Akkadian than either of those languages because there are 3,000 years of inscriptions. So Akkadian is a very, very familiar tool, and the ancient scribes translated things from Sumerian into Babylonian, or into Akkadian rather, for their purposes, and then when the great decipherments were made, the modern scholars used the same system to understand it ourselves. So this is a bit of landscape, that's to say sky, water, trees, you know, the sort of thing that they have in rock in various places. And it's the banks of the rivers that produce this fantastic clay which has no bits in it normally, and they have a reed like this from this bunch cut straight across like a chopstick in a particular way, which they use to impress the signs into the surface of the clay. So it's a kind of printing. It is not writing at all at its outset. Well, actually, before I get into a hot water, the most important thing, I didn't tell you anything important. Okay, let's start at the beginning. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is a very boring slide in blue. And the point about it is this, that it illustrates, without any intellectual effort on anybody's part, the fact that the signs of this writing system before 3000 BC were, as you see on the left, purely pictographic. That is to say, they encapsulate an object by drawing a simple childlike drawing to represent it. So a foot, for example, means the Queen Elizabeth II ship, and the plough means a table tennis table. You see how it works, it's quite straightforward really. And these pictographic signs, which once stood for ideas, evolved in their time to write sounds as well as images. Sorry, I'm getting to this is what I wanted to show you. Okay, so some of the earliest tablets that we have are not the beginning of the writing, but they're very near the beginning. And we can see very readily that this pointed vessel which sticks in the ground is a vessel for beer, and the sign for barley on the other side next to the circular numbers is a sign for barley, and they stand for what they look like. So the Sumerian who wrote this sign, it's a very important thing to notice actually that one of the first signs recorded ever is the sign for beer. There are theories about why that might be. So if a Sumerian came into the room and looked at this thing, he would say cash is the word for beer, and probably try and take it off the screen. So it's a graphic symbol. But what actually happened, which was so clever, is that somebody realised that as well as having all these signs which looked like, sounded like what they looked like, you could just take the sound out and write with it. Look, start again. On the right, you see, ladies and gentlemen, the sign for barley. It is recognisable because it looks like a piece of barley. So when you draw this sign on the tablet, it means barley. At the same time, the Sumerians developed the idea, the so-called rebus script idea, whereby you could draw an ear of barley, not to mean barley, but to give you the sound of the word for barley. So, in other words, the Sumerian reads cash for beer, that's the word for cash, and if he sees this barley, he would say shet, which means barley. But at the same time, it was possible around this period and ever thereafter to take such a graphic symbol for the sound value alone. So in English, if you wanted to write the word shepherd, where the first syllable was she, S-H-E-H or something, in this script you could use the barley sign to write the syllable she, and it had nothing to do with grain. So this was the essence of the amazing giant thing. So here you have a step further on where you have a man's head in a bowl of food, and this sign, head, existed as a sign for said head. This bowl sign existed separately, but if you put them together, it gives a new value in the word for rations. So what happened was that when this trigger came into somebody's mind, that you could have lots and lots of drawings which were perfectly straightforward because you could see what they were, but you could just use them as sound tools, then the most explosive thing happened because they suddenly discovered that they could record words and sentences and grammar and literature, and that is what has led to this lamentable exhibition next door. So you see here, this is a really exceptionally interesting slide, I think you have to agree, that you see this sign, pronounced ka, can be used to write the word mouth, word, speech, nose, and tooth. And in the Sumerian language, mouth, word, speech, nose, and tooth are not pronounced ka, they have their own independent value. So they devised systems of making all the signs multivalent. So we're used to a perfectly simple system of 26 letters, which are not in any way multivalent, they are just monovalent. So if you learn them once, say after 8 or 9 years of hard work in junior school, then you can write anything you like with them. But all these signs had a whole range of different uses, graphic and phonetic. It's rather absorbing. Let me just sum up by saying this. You want to write the word museum in cuneiform, you end up with this situation. You have a sign for mu, a sign for z, and a sign for and you put them together and spell the word. So in the mind, you have a word like a sausage, you divide it up into syllables in Babylonian, and you find the cuneiform syllables that fit these things, and you squeeze them together, and out comes an incomplete word. And they use this marvellous kind of writing, which philologists call rebus writing. So you're perhaps familiar with the clever writing of E4, and even more clever later. I'll leave you to struggle through the trouble about this is that this is how writing started, and with apologies to our chairman, this is what writing has now become. Because most people under 18 use this kind of device in preference to any other kind of writing at all. So we have a kind of reversal of time. Let me just demonstrate what I mean. Come on, The first time I saw somebody on the underground doing that, it was all I could do to stay in my seat. But I did. This is an interesting thing, and all these surveys of writing in the future. This is such a naive thing. I sometimes write on a piece of paper with a fountain pen in public, and people come across the room and say, "What's that?" So there won't be any writing in the future. There just won't be any writing, because all the support systems will vanish in a haze of electronic dust. And anyway, no one will remember anyway how to do it. And probably nobody will have anything to say worth listening to. So the thing is, after a century or two of experiment and trying this and trying that and sharing out signs that all the sounds that they knew could be written down, all the words they knew could be written down, they had a tool which, written on clay with a stylus, enabled them to record the Sumerian language very fluently and the Akkadian language very fluently, and also many other languages too, because in the Middle East, the Elamites and the Iranians and other populations borrow the writing system in order to record their own language. So what looks like a kind of obscure and extraordinary matter became a very flexible, adaptable writing system. And it is quite interesting that my inventive friend Jeremy Black, who was born on the same day as me and was an Assyriologist and therefore proves that astrology must be true, did Assyriology in Oxford, and Oliver Gurney, who was his teacher, when they arrived for the first term, the first thing they had to do was to take a sign list and write out in pencil the first chapter of Pride and Prejudice using cuneiform signs. It had a rather good effect in some ways, because it did certainly instill in the young student some understanding of how this writing system really did function. It also got rid of students who weren't completely nerdy. Now, once the writing system existed, we had this culture with literature of all kinds, and lexicography, and science, and astronomy, and astrology, and word lists, and grammars, everything they use writing for all the kind of stuff that we do, but with the difference from the modern world that only a minority of people in the culture were really fluent in the script. There were families of scribes where young boys, usually boys, were sent to school to learn to write, and they went through a whole rigorous kind of training system, so that using all the signs in their mind, they could write down what anybody said to them, whatever language it was in, if necessary, but usually Sumerian and Akkadian. So we have, among all the treasures at our disposal, which you'll be glad to know, since there are 135,000, I didn't bring slides of all of them, this is two slides at once of a tablet from about 1750 on the Babylonian school. So we have lots of these curricular things. We can see how the scribes learned to make vertical wedges and sideways wedges and diagonal wedges on bits of clay over and over again until they could make proper signs, and then they started to do literature. So in the morning, you've got a lump of clay from the bin in the schoolroom, and you made a kind of ball and then flattened it, so you get these round buns, when they use the term in public, as a classic example of a school writing sport. And what happened in school was there was a teacher, an old learned scholar, who sat at the front and probably did the crossword and fell asleep. The actual work was done by, say, 14-year-olds who would teach 8-year-olds, something of the kind. And as they mastered the script, they had a daily exercise, something like a proverb, like never trust women, they cut the throat of young men, that kind of helpful advice for later life. The oldest pupil, or semi-pupil teacher, would write the signs in such a way that you take the stylus, which has a straight edge, and draw a line, and then the 4 or 5 signs in each line are hung from it, rather like washing when it's pegged up to dry. So there are 4 lines of text. And what happened was that the younger people then stared at this thing rigorously until he memorized it completely, and then turned over the tablet and wrote from memory on the back the signs. Now, I know you haven't been in Assyriological circles that long yet, but perhaps you can already see that the writing on the one is certainly superior to the other. And they had this marvellous system, which I feel I need to share with you, in the school, as we learned from their school text about how to command detention of pupils, and that was they were beaten vigorously and painfully and reiteratedly until they learned the signs, which actually is quite a good educational system. I never really fully understood why it's fallen out in Britain. So we have hundreds of these, and the curriculum can be put together from it, and they have mostly illuminating spelling mistakes and signs missed out and all kinds of things. But my favourite example of school disobedience is this object here, which you can see from the lower corner. It's in fact a round tablet, but this is a close-up photograph. And this is, for certain, the oldest caricature in the world. So it's from the 18th century BC, and it is a drawing by a pupil who is probably smarting from wounds and full of resentment and not wanting to learn this stupid script anyway and wanting to go to play football, who, sitting at the back, drew this malevolent, ill-mannered caricature of a cuneiform teacher. This Weasley thing is the mouse. It's a Weasley mouse. And you see hair sticking out of the nostrils and so forth. And I think he must have drawn it with a pointer, passed it round the classroom, and probably got beaten all over again. There's something wonderful about that, because one of the most serious... What is that? Mouse or something? Anyway, it's not me. No. One of the most marvellous things about all this stuff, and there's thousands of these tablets, and they look like nothing on Earth. They look like they come from the moon to most people. But when you devoted 15 or 20 years to learning the script and sit back to enjoy yourself, the tablets are full of the most amazing things. I mean, our chairman talked about speaking to people across all the ages. That is exactly what happens. But sometimes the most effective thing are things where there isn't any words, because you can see the whole of that situation. That is somebody hating being at school and starting a doodle and suddenly making it into something really meaningful. So I brought a few splendid things to show you, just to illustrate the point that we did get some tablets here. We did actually. They're rather small. We have stores and stores, and then we have reserve stores, and then there's a couple of boxes that nobody knows where they are most of the time. We fished out, and they look lovely. I mean, I don't want to denigrate the achievement. I want, when you see them, your heart to swell with a certain amount of time, but they're all to do with receipts and the business world, because writing, I didn't tell you at the beginning, to tell you to leave too early, but the writing system was developed by the ancestors of the Inland Revenue, and the first 300 or 400 years of writing was solely devoted to that lifeless and unpleasant kind of profession. And you see on the left here is in Philadelphia, and it's a medical text. And it was written in about 2300 BC in the Sumerian language, and this is the reverse. The stop on it means stolen, because I pinched it off the internet. But the thing is, it's got many columns of writing with a whole succession of treatments for a virulent kind of sore, sometimes known as the Baghdad boil, which has been a plague in Iraq since day one, the kind of sore that will never get better and never get better. And there's a series of recipes with materials ground up and applied and bandaged on in oil, a whole sequence of recipes, which, this is an important matter. The tablet's written in about 2400, but they didn't start learning information in 2401. It's already at the long end of a long process of collecting plants, experimenting with plants, codifying the results, putting them into a uniform system. So Lord knows how many centuries of work lies behind this rather finished and extraordinary matter. So this is about 2400. This is written in the 6th, you're right, written in the 6th century, and it's a tablet to do with epilepsy. And there are many doctors who devoted their attention to the study of diseases, and epilepsy was a very creepy disease even for them, and punishment from above dropping on somebody, and all you can imagine the theological writing about it. But this tablet has nothing to do with such matters. It is, in fact, a very matter of fact description of a whole series of different epileptic responses, features, different kinds of vehemence, people running around making noises, trying to tear their clothes and all that kind of thing. So from a modern clinical point of view, it's most disconcerting to read a translation of that if that's what you do for a living today. Of course, the trouble is that these things they're much better in the original, really. That can't be helped. Yeah. Now this is an absolutely marvellous tablet. You know about Egypt, of course, the other writings. Don't really want to talk about it, it's hardly very interesting. We have a department of Egypt, so we don't completely ignore them. But this tablet here, I really wanted you to see for yourselves, because it comes from a time in the 14th century when Egypt had this empire in the Middle East, and because they were much more interested in theology and monotheism, they failed to supervise the roads and the commissions in all their outlying satellites and captured places. So robbers were everywhere, caravans were interrupted, and rulers of these small places wrote angry letters to the Pharaoh in Egypt for assistance. Now, this is what is so captivating to me. The guy in this particular case was a ruler of a people called the Mitanni in Syria. And this Tushratta, the king, had a dishy daughter, and he'd been persuaded to hand over this daughter to the Pharaoh as one of his wives. So probably they thought, and he reassured their mother, that this was a good political move and all that. But what he did was a silly thing, which I'm sure none of you would do, which is he handed over the daughter before he got the money. Tushratta, the Mitannian, then had to write a very diplomatic letter to the Pharaoh, which firmly made the point that he wanted the gold. So the way he did it was the only way at his disposal. So in his court he had a Babylonian professional scribe. So he would dictate in Mitanni the text of the letter out loud, and the Babylonian scribe then transcribed it in his mind in cuneiform and wrote the letter out in cuneiform signs. So whether the diplomatic occasion is what the Mitanni ruler actually said at the time, we will never know. But it is interesting that these letters always begin, Lib Huaria, may you be well, may you flourish, may your flocks and sheep flourish, and your dogs and mother-in-law flourish, and it goes on and on and on about flourishing, and then it gets to the point where's the money. So it's a fine matter of adjustment to get it correct. I also think that dictating a letter for someone to read is rather a modern invention, because if you've not done it before, it's not so straightforward, because people say, he starts off, tell that bastard, we're on our way with the ark. No, hold on, okay. Dear Lib Muare. So there must have been a whole stuff like that. But eventually, probably, people correctly, if you get someone to dictate a letter, now they always start off and then, oh no, hold on a minute, and then I'm sure this has always been true. So a dictated letter without corrigendum in it is itself the fruit, probably, of a whole day, and then the scribe went home and wrote it out properly before it could be taken by a runner from Syria to Egypt, where the Pharaoh had a Babylonian on his team who then would read out in his mind the Babylonian and translate it into Egyptian. So all this fuss about emails, it seems to me, is exaggerated. It's a terrific system. It employs a lot of people. And I don't know why that's fallen out of use. A really beautiful thing, which you must not be allowed to escape seeing, is this bit at the bottom, because that ink inscription is in hieratic Egyptian. And what happened was, when this tablet arrived in the chancery, it was discussed, presumably in front of the pharaoh. Some reply was drafted, like, well, we'll look into it, or something like that. And then the scribe who was in charge of filing wrote in his own script, in ink, at the bottom what it was about. So this is also something where, if you think for a second what that reflects, it's remarkable, because for most people, all cuneiform tablets look the same. So if you have 20 or 30 Italian tablets from Tashraka and the king calls for a particular one, you don't want to have to read them all to find the one in question. So this is one of two examples of these two writing systems, hieroglyphic writing and cuneiform writing on a single object. And I think it's fantastic. Should have borrowed it. So when writing was done on clay, it was done by impressing the stylus, displacing the body of the clay in various wedge shapes, which is what cuneiform means, wedge shape. So you can see on the right, well, on the left firstly, this is a stone inscription where the wedge shapes are imitated directly by hammering into the stone to make it look like it's clay, but actually it's stone and was meant to last forever. So they had an interesting detached view of the cuneiform, that they could mimic the natural format which comes from impression in a stone where it's actually unnecessary. And this stone passage at the bottom has a very flowery inscription indeed, lurching off in all directions, and I don't know what was behind that, but it might have been open. The thing is, in school, children were beaten not only to learn, but also not to improvise, because they didn't want any fancy work, they didn't want people inventing new signs, or anything like that, or writing personal love letters to girls in the other classroom, or something like that. That was not allowed. This is all very interesting, isn't it? This is a clay cone. We have a departmental excavation that gives through it. Sorry, it's something we have thousands of these clay cones, thousands of them, and John Taylor, who's in charge of them, poor fellow, tells me they're really very interesting. They are very interesting indeed, if you know what to look for. And what you have to look for is variations for which another word might be minutiae. But after serious run of seasons, careful dedicated work, and some conclusion will be reached, and we're all, of course, looking forward to it. The point about those is something rather remarkable, because in the prehistoric period, buildings were often decorated with long clay nails which were pushed into the wall when it was soft, and the heads of the nails, which were different colours, pink, green, grey, and so forth, they used to make a kind of mosaic pattern, rather beautiful. And with the passage of time, it occurred to somebody that one could write these inscriptions about who built the temple and why and where it was on the shaft of the cone, and then pushed into the wall as a kind of message for the future. So if the wall fell down, someone could pick this up and say, oh, that's a very interesting thing, it was King so-and-so, we have to rebuild it. So they were done with that in mind. But it does illustrate a very important matter, that if you have that invisible in a wall, the gods, who of course can read cuneiform fluently, some of them I think even have PhDs, they can read through a wall. That is beyond me. So there's something I have to tell you about. Well, there are lots of things I have to tell you about, but this funny thing at the top is a brick, perhaps you can see, with a bit of an inscription in between lines, preserved in the middle, the panel of writing. This was engendered by a brick stamp, because when a building was produced of bricks, there were thousands and thousands of them, and at certain times, say one every 12th brick, was stamped with the name and titles of the ruler, as in the same way as a message for the future. So we found a few pieces of these brick stamps where the signs were cut in reverse, which could then produce the same inscription without somebody having to write it every 5 minutes. You know what this is? This is the side of a cylinder. Does everybody know about the side of a cylinder? It's very interesting. The interesting thing about it, I'll tell you one thing about it, it's supposed to be the first charter of human rights. You know about this? The Shah of Iran thought it was the first charter of human rights. And it was mistranslated in gold, and now it is a symbol of human rights all over the world, which is not a bad thing. But the trouble about the argument that this is the first charter of human rights is that there weren't any human rights in antiquity. mentioned this to a few people, but they take no notice. It's the same sad story, isn't it? Right, now a few other small points while we're here. Up on the top right hand corner, there's a bit of the Code of Hammurabi in the Louvre, which is about 12 feet high. The writing goes all over the surface, and it has rules about how to be good and what happens if you're bad. And the writing is written in a very formal, monumental style. You can see with lots of straight lines and wedges, very beautiful, very beautiful. And this stone here belonged to Nebuchadnezzar, who lived about 1,000 years later. And all his royal inscriptions are written in imitation of this archaic writing. All of them, without exception. There's no royal inscription in contemporary writing. So this is an interesting thing, because it tells you that the Babylonians revered antiquity and revered ancient times explicitly, but also that the impact of an inscription in old writing would have the same effect on the Babylonian reader as with us if you have a place called the Oldie Tea Shoppy. You are more likely to go in there because subconsciously your inner person tells you if they've been making tea and scones since the time of Chaucer, they probably know by now how to do it properly. It has that same kind of idea, which is rather crude, but nevertheless somewhat effective. And the nicest thing at the bottom is one of these bricks stamped, and there's an Aramaic name there of a workman who was obviously building one of Nebuchadnezzar's great things, and in the lunch hour, sitting there looking at this stupid inscription, I'm Nebuchadnezzar, I'm me, I'm marvellous. And the guy put his finger and wrote his name in Aramaic, right down on top of it, as if to say, up yours. And when we had that exhibition about sedition or whatever it was, that was one of the favourite objects that they had. I could do something else really remarkable, considering it's just the British Museum. I mean, it's not the British Museum. Where are we? Oh, the British Library. Some bricks with stamps are known where some of the lines are upside down, the signs are upside down. And the only explanation for that is that the frame in which the signs were placed, where they were cut in kind of matrices, which if they were full of clay, needed to be washed out, they'd rinse them through, and sometimes the matrices were put in upside down. So like with the postage stamp, if something goes wrong, we have bricks with these things. So the Babylonians invented movable type. They invented movable type, and they didn't do anything other than stamp bricks like that. How are we doing for time? Oh, cool.
Quarter two.
What? I hope you all went to see the Ashbari exhibition, did you? Looks like he's 8 foot tall. James Bond actually about 4.5 feet with a paunch and a berry. So this is a fake photograph, let me admit it freely, but I thought to keep the end up, I ought to do this. This is the top shelf is the thing we reconstructed in our gallery. Because we know from archaeology that tablets in libraries, of which there were many, were kept in niches in the wall like this, like old records used to be in a record store on end. So in our upstairs gallery, we made the top shelf with our other installation about the tablets. So I rather cleverly, I think, in some way, produced a real library. Now this is a real library, and when I say real library, I want to make it perfectly clear what I mean about it. You see, Ashford House idea was to bring under one roof all the inherited knowledge and lore from before. As far as we know, he was the first person to do it. And he prosecuted this with a great deal of enthusiasm and a great deal of success, because he had an empire, he had all the money in the world, and people did what he said when he told them to do it. So when we had our exhibition, we wanted to make some kind of display which would dazzle people at the size of it and quantity, because there are about 25,000 pieces of tablets from India, about 25,000. And some of them are this big, and some of them are this big, and all sizes in between. So the keeper, Jonathan Tubb, at a meeting early on in the planning of that exhibition, announced his intention of having all the Nineveh tablets on display, and 2 of the MAs fainted there and then. We have to slacken off a little. But that is the sort of thing that Ashurbanipal's library would have looked like. And one of the interesting things is tablets sometimes have holes down the edge. That's a different matter, but they never have writing on the edge. And since we know that they were stored on end, this means that all the readers in the library must have been very good and put them back where they belong. This was a breakthrough at the time, but I don't know any other library where that prevails, except in a certain number of libraries where the librarians will not let you take anything off the shelf anyway because it spoils the look. So this is what we did in our exhibition. Perhaps you've all seen it. I don't know what to make of it. People went ooh and ah, which was the main point. We had a special tape recorder there. We sharply take some breath, and then we could check the wind speed later in the studio. And a lot of people were impressed by it, but the way they laid out like people who are missing teeth. So what this is, big to small, I don't know. But Ashurbanipal would have had 20 fits if would have seen something like that. But nevertheless, it gave people an idea of what it looks like. It was very splendid at the time. It should still be there. Now, I want to show you a few other small things. This is part of the Gilgamesh tablet series to do with the flood. This is our most famous tablet. It's sometimes on biscuit tins, what more could you ask for? I draw your attention to it because those of us who love this writing system and defend it against all challenges believe that it was in fact calligraphy that motivated the king of scribes. And calligraphy and control in this manuscript is superb. And this is an interesting point here, that cuneiform is always right justified, which if you ever try to write an article to send it off, it looks much more convincing if it's right justified, so I see the point. But in this case here, when there isn't quite enough, they leave a gap in the middle, so they can do that, and sometimes they have a really long wedge also to fill it up. Now, this is the best kind of writing on the best kind of clay from Nineveh, and sometimes, well, at the bottom of the tablets, there's always a colophon that says, belong to the king, no one can take it away, this is mine, and so forth and so forth. And you can see here that the signs which make up part of this colophon, it says king of the universe, king of the, and then Ashur, but we know what it means. And this is written in big scratchy letters, which are quite different from the normal signs, but sometimes when a tablet was being copied, they forgot to put the colophon. So when it was too dry, they could take recourse to painting the cuneiform on the clay. Now this is much, much more significant than you might imagine, because again they've imitated with a brush or perhaps a carved nib in red the shape of the wedges, which are actually impressed into the surface. So like with the stone writing, they've tried to create the impression of cuneiform, but there's a bit on the right too, those are the only 2 scraps we have. But they are terribly significant, because I had tried to write in ink cuneiform with a brush or with a cut nib, and freehand, and it's incredibly difficult to get the wedges of the same height in a line like that without anything to go with. So what it means, and I'm always interested in this matter that when you have a piece of evidence, you don't go, oh well, it's it, but you see what's behind it. What is behind it is many people must have written cuneiform in ink very often for a very long time. In other words, it was part of the system. It wasn't invented one Thursday because 2 tablets were dry. They took recourse to that because they couldn't do the normal writing. But what it means is that there were people who wrote cuneiform in ink, period. And we've only got that scrappy stuff. Then there's this other amazing thing. This is a diptych hinged in the middle, as you can see, of 2 panels with a raised rim of all made of ivory, and you can see that the panel itself has been scarified with a blade, and originally, up until the edges, it was filled with wax. And when the wax was nearly dry, it could be pressed with cuneiform exactly like clay. And we know from the library records they had hundreds of these things, sometimes diptych, sometimes triptych, and the hinges are still partly preserved. And they are a book. I mean, I hate to boast. But we're talking here the 6th century BC, and that is a book. As a matter of fact, on the right there, you see a flake of wax from which the cuneiform can still be read. So we have the use of ink on, we don't know what support apart from clay, but surely wood, surely this, that, and the other. And we have these wax books used to write cuneiform. And among all the resources from Nineveh, these are the rarest things of all. But that is surely misleading. It's just this was dug out of a well in Nimrud among wet mud and sediment. And that's how it survived. If it had been buried in the surf, we would have had nothing. So Malawan sent a very deep hole and sent a couple of boys down to fish things out until the boys didn't come back. So perhaps we'll leave it at that. But those are remarkable, and the fact is we can still some kind of reading. So at the end of it all, Cuneific, the unspeakable happened. The Babylonians and the Medes from Iran conquered Nineveh. They sacked the town, the city, they sacked the palace, and they destroyed the library rooms, or at least they thought they did, and set fire to them. And of course, if you have a library of clay, that's not such a nightmare, because what happens is you get clay turned into terracotta. If it's very hot, then you're going to have this problem with vitrification, distortion. This tablet is one of our most dramatic examples of a tablet which has been in much too hot a fire for its own good. But on the whole, the 20,000 tablets or more which we do have profited from this destruction rather than suffered. And we always thought, and we made this point discreetly in the exhibition, that the much vaunted library in Alexandria that schoolboys always used to know about, which had thousands and thousands of scrolls in, was almost certainly influenced by Ashurbanipal's collecting policy, because it was such an innovation in the world. People must have talked about it, people took rare inscriptions to the king. This must have had its influence on the creation of the Greek library, except they didn't have a no smoking sign. Skip this boring thing. Yeah, I'm going to show you a few spectacular things where I expect, even at this late stage, an ooh or an ah. The oldest map of the world. Yeah, exactly. You can see from the educational device next to it, which is generated by one of the museum's two computers. The world was regarded as round. And so the ring of water encloses the known world. And the big river going from north to south, with Babylon written across it in English, which was very much ahead of their time. That is the Euphrates River. And then there's the Persian Gulf at the bottom. And this is a map of the world from the Babylonian point of view. And off the edge of the world, off the rim of the world, into the distance of the night sky, there are these mountains. And one of them turned out to be called, have on it a thing called the Great Wall. Because the fragment, that fragment at the top right, was missing. We found it in a box of fragments, and it joined on, and it said the Great Wall. So everybody thought this was the Great Wall of China, except it wasn't built then. So that was the end of that. Anyway, the thing about this, it looks like nothing on Earth. It's really horrible looking, but when it was new, it was a tour de force, because clay is a very unforgiving medium. If you make a mistake when you're writing, you cannot kind of smooth it over in such a way that no one will see it. It leaps out at the eye, however you do it. So to have all this inscription on this side and inscription on the other side, And then to draw this map with a pair of compasses in the middle to draw the circles, you see they invented the compasses as well as printing, as I mentioned. It's an amazing list, really. But the only thing we didn't invent, we Mesopotamians, is gunpowder. As far as I'm concerned, the Chinese can keep that. But they had something which they could draw a circle with, which is remarkable, and everything is done without any mistakes. So it's a tour de force of the scribal art. It is such a difficult medium to work in, and drawings of any kind are very rare. So this illustrates something else important about collections like here and us. This is unique, this object. So people talk about it quietly, in case vibrations make another piece fall off it. It's almost a grail of holy proportions. But the fact is, in its time, there must have been loads of them, because early Greek maps had a picture of the world surrounded by water, with what they call the T and O in classical sources. The T and O map. And the O is the ring of water, and the T is the junction of the two water supplies inside, upside down. And Greeks in Babylonia, in sufficient number, must have seen these things and made their own drawings and taken them home, and they moved into the traditional world maps. So if you've only ever seen the Greek ones, you've only got half the picture. If you put them side by side, it's astonishing. So don't despair, there's only about another 709, 10, 611 slides. Now this is very important. I want you all to pay attention now. It's very, very important. This is a school tablet from about the 5th century, so 1,000 years later than the one with the caricature. And it's got 3 columns of writing. So I put in this guide for those of you who are still laggard about learning the sign, even though we've been going for so long. It goes like this: R, B, D, Da, A, U, Za, He, Tu, Ya, Ka, La, Me, Nu, Sa, Ya, Nu, Pe, Tsu, Ku, Mi, Shi, Ta. Okay? That is not a haiku. It's the alphabet. It's the alphabet in the right order. And in point of fact, it is the Aramaic alphabet. So this is an astonishing donation of knowledge in one single swoop, because you cannot write consonants in the cave. All the signs have vowel plus consonant, like E, or consonant plus vowel, like B. You cannot write B on its own, or any other letter on its own. You have to have a vowel in front or behind. So this comes from a classroom where everything is done in Babylonian, but all the kids know Aramaic. So they are bilingual. And the teacher says, I know you're fed up with this stuff. Okay, what I want you to do today is to find a sign for each letter of the alphabet and write it down in a column. So the point is that they had to find one sign for the letter B. So they could have had ib or b, ab or ba, ub or bu, ed or be, because the vowel is irrelevant. So they picked one at random to represent just the letter B. So this is already a fantastically huge intellectual jump for people who wrote in syllables. That half the sign is redundant. This must have been a very confusing thing until they got the hang of it. So they all found the letters that fitted with the sign of the alphabet, until we got to here. Now this is the most revealing thing of all, because A, B, G, D, A, U, Z is what I call grandmother teaching. So you know, perhaps, if you've got grandchildren, that the point comes when you see them at work that you realise that if you don't teach them to read, nobody is going to teach them. And the way grandmothers do it is very simple. So we're going to the mu, up, z, up, mu, and all that. That's how children used to learn to read and write, and they always learned it. Now, people who are already shaving have trouble with it. So this is very revealing to me that that is what I regard as natural communication of the letters. Now, in Akkadian Semitic language, the first letter is Aleph. So Ah is fine. And when we get down here, the yellow bit, there is this letter in Aramaic, like in Hebrew and Arabic, Ayin, which is a kind of deep guttural. Now, if you were mucking about for fun and you wanted to write Ayin in this way, if you hadn't already written Ah for the first letter, you could use Ah, because in Akkadian there's not a lot of difference, but it's already been used. So the scribe who wrote this tablet decided that he has to give the name of the sign, Ayanu, instead of the sound, in that particular case. So that means that in his mind, alpha, beta, gamma, delta, as the names of the letters existed. They existed. But the job was the sound of the letter, not the name of the letter. And in that particular line, he was constrained to give the name because he couldn't distinguish the sound from the other one. So is that not an amazing thing? You have a classroom full of Aramaic speakers in Babylonia who learn Babylonian, and that's their curriculum. This is obviously an experiment, and it required a mental jump. And whoever did this was sufficiently on the ball to twig that in that place we have to use the names that we already know. Otherwise, it would have been Allah, Alpu, B2, Gamlu, and all that stuff written out in normal phonetic again. So this is like a drop of drips. Okay, about three more things. This game, I take it you know, in the Royal Game of Earth, it's in the British Museum. The Sumerians played it in the middle of the 3rd millennium. Very important thing, marvellous stuff. See my forthcoming book in another 23 years. The juicy and marvellous thing about it is that this was written. The board comes from about 2,500 BC. This tablet was written in the 2nd century BC, when the Greeks were already in Babylonia, and the Babylonian scribe wrote down the rules for this game, how to play it in Babylonian. And he was a clever guy. He was an astronomer, and he wrote about it in astronomical terms, about the pieces on the board. And from this, we know how to play it. That's kind of cute. Now look, this stuff about Greek and Romans. You've probably picked up the tone before about Greek and Roman stuff. The fact is that the Greeks went to Babylonia to find out the truth. Because they knew that the Babylonians for centuries and centuries had collected data about the visibility of the planets, about comets, about the weather, about all manner of things, collected the data in systematic chronological order for centuries and centuries. And the things that the Greeks never had when they started all their synthesizing of ideas was this data. So there can be no question whatsoever but that the Greeks from Greece went to Chaldea or Babylon in order to see for themselves what this was all about. Now this is such an important matter, hardly anybody had ever taken any notice of it. But the fact is this, we can see from some certain pieces of evidence that the Babylonians and the Greeks, when they met, they obviously fell into a complete collaboration and friendship. So nobody in Greece said, you want to do this, you go home and do it. There's nothing, there's no copyright, there's no money involved. It was a few guys from MIT going for the summer to Oxford and working out how the universe works and going home all feeling happy. That's what happened. And we can prove that's what happened. But this is the first point, because most of the resources that the Greeks used and brought into Greece were in tables of numbers. Most of them were. So that means that if you know how to write all the numbers, you know the days of the week and the months of the year, and you know light and dark and good and bad, you can sit in a library and transcribe hundreds of tablets from the clay into parchment in ink. And that is what they did. I will show you in a minute. But this is the first step, because the librarians in Babylon must have said, look, if you're going to do this, you've got to learn a few things. You've got to get some idea of this script. So this is a school tablet even later than the one with the alphabet. And on the other side, there are words for canal, Palal in Sumerian and Atapu in Akkadian, written in cuneiform on the other side. And here we have the same stuff transcribed into Greek by some Greek trying to learn this script. He can never remember what the signs are, so he wrote a crib on the back, thereby giving us a transcription by ear of what he heard in the classroom. So the Sumerian, which we read Palal, is Falal in Greek. And the Babylonian Atapu, which we read, they read Athas. So the endings fall off. And there's about 6 of these tablets. They're full of amazing material because it's like a tape recorder on somebody's lap, hearing the Babylonians in the classroom, and you rewind it now and out it comes. It's a kind of miracle that we have this stuff. And this was the result. This tablet here has columns and columns of numbers. You can easily see, perhaps, how the ones on the side, the diagonal ones are 10, 20, 30, and there are first and last visibilities of Mercury in some god-forsaken month in the 2nd century BC. It's called Syllabary B. It's very famous among people who like syllabaries. Anyway, some years ago, this genius, mathematical astronomer, was in university in America, and an old professor who happened to have a bit of papyrus which he bought as a boy, produced it at lunch and showed it to this eminent genius. And the eminent genius ran his eye down the column. There's more of it in this, I just pulled a little bit to show you, and immediately recognized it before he even swallowed as paralleling, duplicating this cuneiform list, because he was working on a major edition of this tablet, and the numbers, which are quite idiosyncratic, ran in his mind, and when he saw them in Greek, he realized not that this was a Greek list of numbers on a piece of papyrus, but this was a transcription into Greek from this composition, not necessarily that tablet. Yeah. So it proves how knowledge can go from 3,000 years of culture into a new language because of a few people collaborating into a whole new lease of life. And this is not fiction. How do we know? How do we know? Because all this data is couched in sexagesimal numbers. They counted in 60s and parts of 60 and not in tens. So all the information that the Greeks got from Babylonia was couched in sexagesimal numbers. And that is why we have 60 seconds in a minute and 60 minutes in the hour and 360 degrees in a circle. It is a direct linear inheritance from this tradition. So, no, sorry if I've been going on too long. Before I introduce Richard, who's the world's greatest scholar of the most interesting side of cuneiform, in comparison with which all this pales into insignificance, is going to tell you about how it works. But before I want you to look at these very carefully things. You'll see these things from Göbekli Tepe from 9000 BC. You are seeing this picture? Okay, it is my contention, after a year of a lifetime wasted in this profession, that is writing. It is not a pattern. It is not a design. It is writing with 3 symbols, which are very similar to the early pictographics from Mesopotamia. Now, this thing was excavated at Göbekli Tepe, which is 9000 BC. And the excavator said it was a decorated piece of stone. Now, if that thing had been excavated in Iraq in the Uruk period, about 3000 BC, nobody would have batted an eyelid. Now, when I was a student, we were told that writing began in Mesopotamia when people lived together in big complex societies and they built complex buildings, temples and stuff like that, which they couldn't have done in isolation. And because of the requirements of that kind of life, writing came into being. Now, if that is true, then the reverse must be true. So in 9000 BC, when they were building these breathtakingly complicated series of temples, generation after generation, with everybody collaborating together, if it was true that writing and complexity go together, then they must have had writing. So I look on the website for Göbekli and I nearly fall off my chair, because here is exactly what you would expect, a kind of simple early pictographic sign. 3 pictographic signs on an object from that period. If that is what, in fact, that is, it means that Sumerian writing, beginning in 3500, was not the beginning at all, but actually it had been going all this time, and that Sumerian might be a kind of late, rather miserable derivation of a much older system. Who knows? But it does indicate how rash it is to make statements about who has the oldest writing. The most important thing is that cuneiform writing is older than hieroglyphs. Now, I would like, while you're here, to introduce, as I say, my good friend and colleague, Richard Darbrill, who is going to mount the staircase. Take it away.